Something is happening inside the WNBA right now that nobody is talking about loudly enough. Not the rivalries, not the drama, not the endless debate about whether rookies get too much attention or too little respect. This is something far more serious, something that sits at the intersection of medicine, money, and institutional negligence. The league's single most valuable player is being quietly dismantled by the very system that was supposed to make her unstoppable. And one of the most respected performance trainers in the history of professional sports just stepped forward with a warning so sharp it should be shaking boardrooms from Indiana to New York. The question isn't whether Caitlyn Clark is talented enough to survive this. The question is whether the people around her are competent enough to let her. There has never been an entrance into the WNBA quite like Caitlyn Clark's, not even close. By the time she was drafted by the Indiana Fever, she wasn't just a highly anticipated rookie. She was a cultural moment, a tidal wave that had been building through 4 years of record-breaking college performances, sold-out arenas, and a level of national attention that women's basketball had never come close to experiencing before. Television ratings climbed. Merchandise flew off shelves. Venues that previously struggled to fill seats were suddenly turning people away at the door. For the first time in a long time, the WNBA wasn't just a league that hardcore fans followed quietly. It was must-watch television for millions of casual viewers who had never paid attention to women's basketball before Clark arrived and made it impossible to look away. But underneath all of that electricity, something was being overlooked. When Clark showed up for her first professional season, the conversation around her physical transformation was overwhelmingly positive. She had clearly put in serious work during the offseason. Her frame looked stronger. Her upper body had filled out. Her legs appeared more powerful. Analysts and commentators celebrated it as proof of her commitment to leveling up for the professional game. She was praised for taking her body seriously, for understanding that the WNBA required a different kind of physical presence than even the highest level of college basketball. On the surface, it all looked like good news. What nobody was asking, at least not publicly, was whether that transformation had been done correctly. Whether the muscle she had added was being supported by the deeper structural work that elite-level physical development actually demands. Whether her joints, her connective tissue, her nervous system, and her movement patterns had all been brought along for the ride, or whether her body had simply been loaded up with new weight that it hadn't yet learned how to carry. Those are quiet questions. They don't generate highlight clips or social media engagement. They don't show up in the pregame features or the postgame interviews. But they matter enormously, because when they go unanswered, the consequences don't stay quiet for long. Clark's first professional season began to reveal the cracks almost immediately. Groin strains surfaced early. Quad soreness became a recurring issue. Soft tissue problems started appearing on one side of her body, then migrating to the other in a pattern that anyone with a deep understanding of biomechanics would recognize instantly. The injury reports came in steadily, wrapped in the standard language of professional sports, day-to-day, managing her load, being cautious with her recovery. The kind of phrasing designed to sound responsible, while obscuring how serious the underlying situation actually is. For most observers, it read as normal rookie adjustment. The body getting used to a longer season, more physical competition, a higher overall demand. But there is a significant difference between a body adjusting and a body compensating. Adjusting means the system is adapting properly, finding its footing, growing into the new challenge. Compensating means something is already broken and everything else is scrambling to cover for it. One of those is a natural part of development. The other is the beginning of a cycle that, if left unaddressed, doesn't resolve itself. It escalates. And for Clark, the evidence was pointing very clearly in one direction. The people who needed to recognize that distinction either didn't see it or weren't acting like they did. And that's when someone who has seen this exact pattern before decided he'd seen enough. To understand why Tim Grover's involvement in this conversation matters so much, you need to understand who Tim Grover actually is. Not just his resume, but what he represents in the world of elite athletic performance. Grover isn't a traditional trainer. He doesn't work with average professionals or even above-average ones. His entire career has been built around the singular pursuit of maximizing what already exceptional athletes are capable of and then protecting that capability so it lasts. He worked with Michael Jordan through the most physically demanding stretch of his career. He worked with Kobe Bryant. He worked with Dwyane Wade. These aren't just famous names to drop for credibility. These are three of the most physically complex, high-demand athletes in the history of professional basketball. And Grover kept all three of them operating at elite levels for far longer than their bodies probably should have allowed. What makes Grover different from most performance coaches is his philosophy. He doesn't just build athletes up. He studies them with a level of forensic detail that most training programs never come close to approaching. Every movement pattern, every mechanical inefficiency, every subtle imbalance that the eye barely catches but that the body quietly suffers from over thousands of repetitions. He finds those things before they become injuries, and then he fixes them. That is the core of what he does. And it's precisely because he has spent decades doing that work that he is able to look at Caitlyn Clark's injury pattern and recognize it for exactly what it is. Grover has drawn a direct and specific connection between what Clark is experiencing right now and what Jordan dealt with in the early years of his career. Jordan, before he became the player the world came to know, was not physically indestructible. He dealt with ankle problems, groin issues, movement inefficiencies, and muscular imbalances that were quietly undermining the brilliance that everyone around him could see was there. The difference between the Jordan who got derailed by those issues and the Jordan who became arguably the greatest player in basketball history was not talent. It was intervention. Specifically, it was Grover identifying the root causes of those physical breakdowns and addressing them with a level of precision and patience that the standard professional sports medical model simply doesn't offer. What Grover sees in Clark's situation is the absence of that kind of intervention. He's not questioning her talent. Her competitive instincts, her vision on the court, her shooting range, her ability to read a defense and make decisions that most players at any level couldn't execute, none of that is in doubt. What he's identifying is a specific and deeply concerning gap between the physical work that has been done with Clark and the physical work that needed to be done. The muscle she gained in the offseason was real. The strength was real. But strength without sequencing, in Grover's framework, is not just incomplete, it's dangerous. Sequencing refers to the order in which the body's muscles fire and the way the entire kinetic chain, from the feet to the hips to the core to the shoulders, coordinates during movement. When an athlete adds significant muscle mass rapidly, the body doesn't automatically rewire those firing patterns to accommodate the new load. The muscles are stronger, but they may not be communicating correctly. The stabilizers may not be keeping up. The joints may be absorbing force differently than they were before, in ways that create new vulnerabilities. This is the specific concern Grover is raising about Clark. The strength came. But the sequencing work, the deep biomechanical recalibration that should have accompanied that physical transformation, appears to have either been rushed or skipped entirely. And now the body is presenting the bill. The warning Grover is sounding isn't pessimistic. It comes from a place of genuine recognition because he has been exactly here before. He has watched elite talent nearly collapse under the weight of preventable physical breakdowns. And he has also watched what happens when those breakdowns are addressed with the right tools, the right patience, and the right expertise. The outcomes are completely different. That's why he's talking. Because he knows what this looks like when it goes wrong, and he knows what it looks like when it gets fixed. Right now, Clark's situation looks like the former, and nobody in her immediate professional environment seems to be doing enough about it. The specific injuries Clark has been dealing with are not random. That is one of the most important things to understand about this situation, and it's one of the things that makes Grover's analysis so pointed. Groin strains, quad soreness, and bilateral soft tissue issues don't cluster together in a coincidence. They tell a story. And the story they're telling about Clark's body right now is one that any experienced biomechanics specialist would read as a textbook case of what happens when physical development outpaces structural preparation. Start with the groin. Groin strains in athletes are almost never purely about the groin itself. The groin is a connector. It bridges the lower core and the inner thigh, and it plays a critical role in stabilizing the hips during lateral movement, direction changes, and deceleration. When an athlete puts significant new muscle mass onto their frame without simultaneously recalibrating how the hips absorb and distribute force, the groin becomes overloaded. It's being asked to stabilize a body that is now heavier and generating more power than the surrounding structures were trained to handle. Under that kind of repeated stress, it doesn't take long for the tissue to give. And once it does, the compensation begins. Compensation is where the real damage accumulates. When one side of the body sustains an injury, the other side instinctively picks up the slack. The healthy side starts carrying more of the load, absorbing more of the impact, generating more of the force. For a short period, this can work. The athlete continues to function, perhaps at a slightly reduced level, while the injured side recovers. But the problem is that the compensating side is now operating under a burden it wasn't designed to carry alone. Over time, the accumulated stress on that side reaches its own breaking point, and then it fails. Which is exactly the bilateral pattern Clark has been showing. One side, then the other. Back and forth. A cycle that doesn't resolve itself through rest alone because rest addresses the symptom without touching the cause. The quad soreness compounds this picture further. The quadriceps play a critical role in deceleration, specifically in controlling how the knee bends and absorbs force when an athlete slows down or changes direction. Clark's game is built on sudden stops, sharp pivots, pull-up jumpers from full speed, and aggressive drives that require her to go from maximum acceleration to a complete stop in a fraction of a second. That demands extraordinary deceleration control. If the quads are already fatigued or inflamed, their ability to manage those forces drops dramatically. The knee joint then absorbs more of the shock than it should. The surrounding tendons and ligaments pick up the difference, and the risk of a far more serious injury, the kind that doesn't resolve in 2 weeks, begins to climb sharply. This is the car analogy made real. When Clark bulked up, the engine became more powerful. She could generate more force, more speed, more explosiveness than before. But the braking system, the deceleration mechanics, the hip stabilizers, the neuromuscular control that keeps all of that power from becoming chaos, wasn't upgraded to match. So the car goes faster, and when it needs to stop, it can't do so cleanly. Something absorbs the excess force that the brakes can't handle. And in Clark's case, that something has been her groin, her quads, and the soft tissue on both sides of her lower body. The engine is running. The brakes are failing. And every time she's pushed back onto the court before the underlying mechanics are addressed, the situation gets worse. What makes this particularly alarming is that the injuries are following a progression. They aren't staying isolated, and they aren't getting fully resolved between occurrences. Groin injuries that aren't properly rehabilitated at the root level create compensatory tension in the hip flexors and the adductors. That tension alters pelvic alignment. Altered pelvic alignment changes how force travels up through the lumbar spine and down through the knees. Quad strains that stem from deceleration deficiencies don't fully heal if the deceleration mechanics themselves are never corrected. The tissue repairs, the inflammation subsides, the athlete is cleared to return, and then the same mechanical demand that caused the injury in the first place is applied again at full speed. The cycle restarts. This is not speculation. This is a well-documented pattern in sports medicine, and it is exactly what Grover is describing when he talks about Clark's situation. Tim Grover's critique of Caitlyn Clark's injury management doesn't stop at her training program. He's pointing at something larger and more systemic, a fundamental problem with how the WNBA as an institution approaches the health and physical development of its athletes. And when you look at the evidence that has been made public, it is genuinely difficult to argue with his assessment. Professional sports medicine, at its highest level, operates on a proactive model. The goal is not to respond to injuries after they happen. The goal is to identify the conditions that make injuries likely before they occur and eliminate those conditions through precise, individualized intervention. This involves comprehensive movement analysis, kinetic chain assessments, regular monitoring of load and fatigue, neuromuscular testing, and a genuine willingness to reduce an athlete's on-court availability when the data suggests that continuing at full intensity is creating more risk than reward. It is a sophisticated, resource-intensive approach, and the organizations that commit to it see the results in the form of athletes who perform at elite levels for longer than anyone expected. What Grover is describing in Clark's situation sounds nothing like that model. It sounds reactive, ice and rest when something hurts. A modified return-to-play protocol that prioritizes getting the athlete back on the court over ensuring that the underlying issue has been genuinely resolved. Injury bulletins that use deliberately vague language, day-to-day, being monitored, progressing well, that tell the public very little about the actual state of the athlete's structural health. This is the old model. It is the approach that dominated professional sports medicine decades ago, before the field developed a deeper understanding of biomechanics, neuromuscular function, and the long-term consequences of returning athletes to competition before they are structurally ready. It is not the standard that a league with the WNBA's current level of revenue, visibility, and cultural significance should be operating under. The most telling detail in this entire situation is the report that Clark has been seeking outside medical opinions. That single fact communicates more about the state of the Indiana Fever's medical infrastructure than any official statement could. When a first-year professional athlete, someone who is still building her identity within the organization, still establishing relationships, still navigating the political complexity of being a rookie in a league full of veterans, decides that she needs to go outside the team's official medical staff to get answers about her own body, something has gone seriously wrong. Athletes don't do that casually. They don't seek second opinions because they enjoy the inconvenience or the implied confrontation with the organization. They do it because the answers they are getting from inside the system aren't satisfying them, because something in their physical experience doesn't match what they're being told. Clark's instinct to look elsewhere is not a minor detail. It is a signal. Grover's specific concern about deceleration training is particularly worth dwelling on. The vast majority of athletic training programs at every level of professional sports are designed around acceleration, getting faster, getting more explosive, increasing the speed at which an athlete can cover ground, change direction, and generate force. These are measurable, visible improvements that translate directly into on-court performance metrics. Deceleration training, teaching the body to safely absorb the forces generated by stopping, is less glamorous. It doesn't show up as clearly in the highlight reel, but it is arguably more important for preventing soft tissue injury than any amount of acceleration work, particularly for athletes like Clark, whose game depends on sudden stops, sharp cuts, and rapid direction changes at maximum speed. If the Indiana Fever's training staff is prioritizing output, speed, strength, explosiveness, without giving equivalent attention to the body's ability to safely manage that output, they are setting Clark up for exactly the kind of recurring soft tissue failures she has been experiencing. And the fact that these injuries are continuing to occur, continuing to follow that bilateral compensation pattern, continuing to pull her in and out of the lineup without any apparent resolution of the root cause, suggests that the structural intervention Grover is calling for has not happened. The machine is being patched and restarted. It is not being fixed. Physical recovery doesn't happen in a vacuum. This is a truth that elite sports science has understood for years, even if the broader conversation around athlete health is slow to acknowledge it consistently. The environment an athlete inhabits during recovery, the emotional climate, the social dynamics, the level of institutional trust, the presence or absence of psychological stability directly affects how quickly and how completely the body heals. Stress hormones interfere with tissue repair. Anxiety disrupts sleep, and sleep is when the body does the majority of its structural restoration work. A sense of isolation or distrust creates a baseline level of psychological tension that keeps the nervous system in a heightened state, which in turn keeps the body from fully entering the recovery mode it needs to be in. These are not soft, feel-good concepts. They are physiological realities, and they matter enormously for Caitlyn Clark right now. Because the environment she is operating in is, by most available accounts, the opposite of what recovery demands. The locker room tension that has seeped into public view over the course of this season has been hard to ignore. Reports of friction between teammates, family members of other players making their displeasure known on social media, rumors of jealousy over Clark's unprecedented commercial profile, and the attention it brings, all of it creates a background noise of conflict that is deeply corrosive to the kind of cohesion and trust that helps athletes push through difficult periods together. For a healthy veteran who has been through league politics before, that kind of environment is manageable. For a first-year player who is simultaneously trying to prove herself, manage a historic level of public scrutiny, and recover from recurring physical injuries, it is a genuine additional burden. The public scrutiny itself is something that no previous WNBA rookie has had to navigate at anything close to this scale. Every game Clark plays is dissected across social media in real time. Every hesitation, every missed shot, every moment where her movement looks slightly off generates a wave of commentary, some of it supportive, a significant portion of it harsh, and all of it loud. Commentators question her toughness. Critics debate whether her injuries are being exaggerated. Fans who have never watched a professional basketball game before her arrival feel entitled to render verdicts on her physical state based on a 30-second highlight clip. The noise is relentless, and it is inescapable. What is conspicuously absent from this picture is meaningful institutional support. The WNBA, as an organization, has not been visibly proactive about ensuring that its most valuable player has access to the full range of support resources that her situation demands. World-class sports psychology, personal performance specialists, an individualized medical plan that accounts for her specific movement patterns and injury history, a public communications approach that protects her recovery by managing expectations honestly rather than using vague, optimistic language that creates pressure to return before she is ready. These are not luxury items. They are basic components of a genuine athlete development infrastructure, and their apparent absence in Clark's situation says something uncomfortable about the league's priorities. The cruelest aspect of this dynamic is the way it feeds on itself. Clark is the WNBA's greatest marketing asset. The league's revenue, its media visibility, its sponsorship appeal, and its cultural relevance have all been dramatically elevated by her presence. That commercial reality creates enormous pressure to keep her on the court, to keep her visible, to keep the headlines coming and the ticket sales climbing. But the physical and psychological consequences of operating under that kind of pressure without adequate support are compounding the very injuries that threaten to make her unavailable entirely. The system is extracting value from her while simultaneously making it harder for her to sustain the health that would allow her to keep generating that value. It is a contradiction that the people running this league need to confront honestly, because it is not sustainable for Clark or for them. It is worth stepping back from the specifics of Clark's individual situation for a moment and looking at what this moment actually represents for women's basketball as a whole. Because what is happening with Caitlyn Clark is not just one athlete dealing with one set of injuries managed by one organization's medical staff. It is a stress test for the entire professional women's basketball infrastructure. And the results of that test are going to be visible to everyone who is paying attention, including the next generation of female athletes who are watching this league right now and making decisions about what kind of future it represents. The financial stakes alone are staggering. Clark's entry into the WNBA triggered a measurable surge across virtually every revenue metric the league tracks. Television ratings climbed to levels the league had never seen before. Arena attendance records were shattered in markets that had previously been considered modest at best. Sponsorship deals accelerated. Streaming partnerships became more lucrative. Merchandise categories that had barely existed in women's basketball suddenly became meaningful commercial operations. The economic impact of her presence in the league is not modest, and it is not temporary. Or at least, it wouldn't be, if that presence is protected and allowed to develop over the long career arc that her talent suggests she is capable of. But all of that potential value evaporates if Clark's body breaks down in a way that limits or ends her career prematurely. And the scenario in which that happens is not difficult to construct. Groin injuries that are inadequately addressed at the biomechanical level progress to hip impingements. Quad strains that recur without resolution of the underlying deceleration deficit develop into patellar tendinitis. The compensation patterns that are already visible in her injury history continue to migrate through her lower body, creating new points of failure with each cycle. None of these progressions are inevitable. Every one of them is preventable with the right intervention applied at the right time. But without that intervention, the cascade has its own momentum. The message this sends to the next generation is perhaps the most serious long-term consequence of all. There are young athletes right now, in high schools, in college programs, in junior leagues, who are watching how the WNBA treats Caitlyn Clark and drawing conclusions about what a professional career in women's basketball looks like. They are watching whether the league's most prominent player is being genuinely protected or being used up. Whether the medical infrastructure around her reflects a serious commitment to athlete longevity or a short-term transactional mindset that prioritizes gate receipts over structural health. Whatever they conclude from what they observe will influence the decisions they make about their own careers, their own training, their own willingness to invest in a league that may or may not invest back in them. The WNBA has a rare opportunity right now. The Clark era has brought the kind of attention and financial resources that could fund a genuine transformation of how the league approaches athlete development and health management. The money is there in a way it wasn't before. The public attention is there. The cultural moment is there. The only question is whether the people running the league are willing to use this window to build something structurally better, or whether they are going to continue operating on the same reactive, output-obsessed model that Tim Grover is describing, right up until the moment that model produces a catastrophic outcome that the entire sports world will witness in real time. The solution to what Clark is experiencing is not complicated in principle, even if the institutional will to implement it has so far been lacking. Grover's prescription, and the prescription that the available evidence supports, can be broken down into clear, actionable components. The challenge is not identifying what needs to happen. The challenge is whether the Indiana Fever, the WNBA, and the people in Clark's immediate professional circle are prepared to prioritize her long-term structural health over the short-term pressures of a league that has never had this much to gain or lose from one player's availability. The first and most fundamental step is a genuine, comprehensive structural assessment, not a return-to-play evaluation that checks whether the inflammation has subsided. A full kinetic chain analysis that examines how Clark moves, how she lands, how she decelerates, how her hips load and unload force during direction changes, how her core stabilizers are functioning under dynamic conditions, where the compensatory patterns that have already developed are concentrating additional stress, and what specific interventions are needed to address each of those inefficiencies. This is the kind of assessment that Grover conducted with Jordan. It is detailed, it is time-consuming, and it requires expertise that goes well beyond the standard athletic training credential. But it is the foundation on which any genuine recovery and long-term development plan has to be built. The second step is bringing in outside expertise, which by all accounts Clark herself has already recognized the need for. The Indiana Fever's in-house medical staff may be perfectly competent within their standard scope of practice. But Grover's concern, and the injury history supports this concern, is that the standard scope of practice being applied to Clark's situation is not sufficient for the complexity of what her body is dealing with. Specialists in biomechanics, neuromuscular performance, and sport-specific movement rehabilitation need to be part of her care team. Not as a replacement for the existing staff, but as an addition that elevates the level of intervention being applied to the most important athlete in the league. The third step is a genuine cultural shift in how recovery is framed and communicated. Right now, the dominant narrative around Clark's injuries, at least in the public messaging coming from the organization, is one that emphasizes toughness and quick returns. She's managing it. She'll be back soon. She pushed through. This framing feels positive on the surface, but it creates a pressure environment that works directly against the patience that genuine structural recovery requires. The Jordan model, the one Grover actually implemented, was not about pushing through. It was about slowing down, addressing the root cause with precision, and returning only when the body was structurally ready to handle full demand. That approach looks like weakness in the short term. Over a 10-year arc, it looks like genius. The WNBA is standing at a crossroads that it may not fully recognize it is standing at. The Clark era has handed the league a gift, an athlete whose talent, personality, and commercial appeal have elevated the entire organization to a level of visibility and financial health that its leaders spent decades trying to achieve. That gift comes with a responsibility that the league has not yet demonstrated it is taking seriously enough. The responsibility to protect what has been given. To build around it rather than burn through it. To treat the athlete at the center of this moment not as a resource to be maximized in the immediate term, but as a long-term investment that requires patient, expert, individualized care. Tim Grover turned Michael Jordan from a brilliantly talented player with a concerning injury history into the most dominant athlete professional basketball has ever seen. He did it by understanding that greatness is not just built, it is protected. It is maintained through precision, patience, and a refusal to accept the reactive, output-first model that most sports organizations default to. Caitlyn Clark has the talent to be that kind of generational force in women's basketball. The only thing standing between where she is now and where she is capable of going is whether the system around her rises to meet the moment. Right now, it hasn't, and the clock is running. What Tim Grover is really saying about Caitlyn Clark isn't just about one athlete or one season. It's a mirror being held up to an entire league. The WNBA has never had more money, more attention, or more reason to do this right, and it is currently in serious danger of doing it wrong in front of the largest audience women's basketball has ever had. Clark's talent is not the variable. Her dedication is not the question. The question is whether the infrastructure surrounding her is capable of protecting something genuinely rare. History has shown, through Jordan, through Kobe, through Wade, that the right intervention at the right moment doesn't just save a career. It transforms it into something legendary. Clark deserves that chance. The real story here is whether anyone in a position of power is paying close enough attention to give it to her.